What does a beautiful future look like to you?
You can flip a negative mood on its head.
This was a talk that was all over the place, but then New York, you are all over the place.
There are experiences that you just don't get anywhere else.
From the virtual stage of the 92nd Street Y, hello and welcome to our civic series, Race to City Hall. My name is Seth Pinsky and I'm the CEO of the 92nd Street Y. I'm honored to be here to host these one-on-one conversations with leading mayoral candidates, covering topics of importance to all New Yorkers, including some suggested by members of our 92nd Street Y community. Thank you all so much for joining us. As we all know, the last year has been an incredibly difficult one for our city. To overcome our challenges, New York is going to need a decisive, collaborative, and creative chief executive. It's for this reason that we at the 92nd Street Y have launched this series. Today, I'm speaking with mayoral candidate Dianne Morales. Before entering the race, Ms. Morales was executive director and CEO of Phipps Neighborhoods, a nonprofit focusing on assisting low-income Bronx residents. Ms. Morales' extensive nonprofit resume also includes senior positions or founding roles in organizations such as The Door, JumpStart, the Broome Street Academy, and an organization focused on Puerto Rico's rebuilding following Hurricane Maria. Additionally, Ms. Morales spent time in the Department of Education under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, opening the Office of Youth Development and School Community Services and serving as Chief of Operations. Earlier in her career, Ms. Morales was a case manager in the New York City child welfare system and a special education teacher in the New York City public schools. Ms. Morales, thank you so much for being here and for talking with me today.
Well, thank you so much, Seth. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, so am I. And before diving into questions about your positions on various policies, I wanted to start, as we always do, just by asking how you and your family have been holding up during the pandemic.
Thanks for that question. We are holding up. We are aware of our privilege and the extent to which, while this pandemic has created challenges for everyone, we are certainly doing better than a significant percentage of the communities that my campaign is seeking to elevate. We have had 3 generations under one roof for the majority of the past year. My parents were here through early January, unexpectedly as a result of transitions in their lives, and sort of getting caught here when the pandemic hit. And my children, both of whom are college students, one is a senior, one is a junior, ended up coming back last March and doing virtual schooling and have been here ever since. So we're hanging in there and grateful to be okay, but it certainly has not been without its challenges. But we're doing all right. Thank you for asking.
Well, navigating 3 generations under one roof is already a major accomplishment. So congratulations on that. And in all seriousness, I hope that everyone stays healthy and safe. So I want to focus most of our conversation today on how you envision governing the city if you're elected mayor. But before jumping into that, I wanted just to take 1 minute to look back at your career before now. And in the mayoral race, I think it's safe to say that among the candidates, you've positioned yourself as among the most progressive. And looking at your resume, much of it is consistent with that. Your time spent in the not-for-profit sector, your time spent working with children in the child welfare system, your time spent as a public school teacher. The one part of your career that's a little bit different is the time that you spent in the Bloomberg administration working, as I understand it, with Joel Klein, the school commissioner. And in the narrative in progressive circles today, many of Michael Bloomberg's initiatives, including his public school initiatives, have come under criticism. So I'm just curious how you view this chapter in your career, and what are some of the positive lessons and some of the negative lessons that you took from that experience?
Sure. Well, you know what? Interestingly enough, I don't view that part, that 2 years in my career as being particularly deviant from the rest of my trajectory. The beginning of the Bloomberg administration with the schools was the beginning of mayoral control over the schools. And I think for me at that point in time, having been a former public school teacher, and having had, and having at that point being a single mom with two young children at the time who were starting to struggle with learning differences, for me, that period of time was filled with hope and possibility around the things that we could change, and the things that we could do differently in the education system. And I think that, that's how I came in. One of the things that Joel used to say that I remember being struck by was that the idea, it was something about the need for us to dismantle the temple before we could rebuild it. And there was something in that promise and possibility that was very appealing to me. I think it didn't take very long for me to start to realize that we just kept rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And so, I became disillusioned, which is why my tenure there wasn't longer. And I also, had some problems with some of the approach and the strategies that were being implemented to supposedly bring about the change. So I went in hopeful, and came out disillusioned, and sort of came back to my sort of roots, if you will. But I do think that there was something for me that was promising around the idea of being able to attempt to tackle some structural and systemic issues, which is not inconsistent with why I'm in this race now.
Well, and that's a great segue, and thank you for that answer. A great segue into the next topic that I wanted to cover, which is the chance to tackle major challenges. And surely one of the major challenges that whoever is elected our next mayor is going to be dealing with is the impact that the pandemic has had on our economy. And the statistics are really sobering. The Independent Budget Office says that we're down about 560,000 jobs from pre-pandemic levels. Unemployment is about 3 or 4 times what it was before COVID hit. And as you've pointed out, I think very importantly, the impacts have not fallen evenly on all segments of the city. They've fallen particularly heavy on Black and Brown communities and communities of color. So I guess as a starting question on this topic, what I'd like to understand is if you were elected mayor in November, what would be, let's say, the first 3 major initiatives that you think would have the most immediate and most impactful effect on the current economic environment?
Sure. Thanks for that question. The only thing I'd want to add to what you just said about the economic downturn and the impact on jobs and the disproportionate impact on jobs is that most disproportionately of all, the impact has affected women of color. Right. So it's the sort of funnel, if you will, or the emphasis is disproportionately on women of color. And we also know that women of color very often are also serving as heads of household. So when you think about that, the impact is particularly burdensome on that community. And so, one of the things that I think about as I think about and talk about how we come out of this place is the need for us to recognize some of the choices that we have made historically in where we rely and where we place the emphasis in our economy. We have failed to recognize for so long the work of caregivers, providers, home health aides, childcare. And so, the fundamental premise of my proposal for economic recovery is one that we refer to as a solidarity economy. The notion of investing in and prioritizing first the care for each other here in New York City. Historically, we have had a model that relies on large corporations and businesses in terms of generating jobs and the sort of economic recovery and stimulus, and that along with that, we have focused on tax incentives and tax subsidies that we direct towards entities that essentially come into our communities, exploit our labor, and extract our wealth. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to fundamentally reframe that and shift the paradigm to one that prioritizes the investments, the tax incentives, and the tax subsidies on the local level, whether that be focusing on small and mid-sized businesses who we know employ over 50% of the local workforce, emphasizing and investing in increasing and expanding worker-owned cooperatives, that could be inclusive of what we call the care economy, what is called the care economy, all of those jobs that actually provide care to family members, to children, to elders, to the disabled, so that the rest of us can actually do other things. And what that looks like if we focus there, which we also know is a population of workers who are predominantly women of color and immigrants. And the idea that if we in fact support and bolster those who are struggling the most, we will all get a boost and elevated from that, while at the same time really generating this local economy in a different way from the way we've done that historically. And I think that there's strength there, and it provides the opportunity to really grow out and up from the ground.
And I want to ask a follow-up question to that, and I don't mean this to be a belligerent question. It really is a question that I've struggled with in my own head. And I've read about your proposals on your website, and they're quite detailed and very interesting. And I was reading about the solidarity economy and the fact that the goal is a unified city, as you say, measuring growth beyond revenue and how well the city serves the most vulnerable and how swiftly we deepen equity. And I personally agree that one of the great challenges facing our city and our country is inequality. And I feel like it's having a corrosive effect on our economic well-being. I feel like it's having a corrosive effect on our politics. But the thing that I'm struggling with in my own head is how we actually overcome that. And what my sense is that you and many others in the mayoral field feel is that an aggressive platform of very progressive policies is the answer. And I guess where I get stuck in my head is that if you look at the most unequal places in the country, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, they tend to be the most progressive cities. And even here in New York, after 7 years of a progressive mayor and an even more progressive city council, by some measures, New York is actually less equal today than it was when Mayor Bloomberg left office. So I guess the simple question that I have is, what evidence do you have or can you provide to voters that more of these policies will solve these issues? And can you point to places where putting these policies into effect has actually had the positive impacts that you're aiming for?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with the premise of your question, which I'm not sure I agree with, quite frankly. I am not sure that we are, in fact, the most progressive. We talk about being progressive, but I don't know that, that aligns with policy decisions and sort of priorities that, in fact, have been made in this city throughout history. And I certainly don't know that it's reflected in who we've elected to lead the city. So I think that there is somewhat of a disparity or a gap, if you will, between the rhetoric and the practice here in New York that I would challenge on that front. And I would also say that I don't necessarily, talk about myself as being the most progressive. I actually somewhat eschew labels in that way because I've spent all my life kind of fighting against being put in a box. Or being defined by other people's standards. So I tend to want my sort of values and proposals to stand on their own, separate from whatever people consider progressives. That being said, I think that one of the things that, insofar as my proposals specific to the economy and the economic recovery go, we saw over the past 12 months, we saw the impact of the tax relief to the wealthy. We saw what happened there. Wall Street got stronger, and our millionaires and our billionaires increased. So I don't know why we would think that investments in the community wouldn't have a similar effect, right? And it's an interesting thing that is often the thing that gets questioned when we see it happen, and we have evidence of it happening with the wealthy, right? So if we prioritize and invest in local communities, there's nothing to indicate that it wouldn't actually benefit those communities and sort of lead to further or additional prosperity, or initial prosperity in those communities when we see it happen with the wealthy. So I'm pushing back a little bit on the premise of your question, because I think that framework and that paradigm in and of itself is flawed. We always put this different kind of onus on things that center community in terms of proof, even though we see those kinds of things work with the wealthy. And I just think one of the things that we do know for sure is that the historic prioritization and investment and sort of incentives to the wealthy have not actually helped those who are struggling the most. So I think it's more than beyond time that we'd be willing to try inversing, doing an inverse of the investments and seeing what that would yield, because I believe it would actually yield good things for everybody.
No, it's helpful, and I certainly am glad that you're pushing back on the question. That's the reason we have you here today. Kind of a related question. You talked in your initial answer about the importance of focusing on mid-sized firms and smaller firms. Yeah. What if you were mayor? How would you approach big business in New York? What would be your attitude towards big business? Do you aim to work collaboratively with big business, or would you view big business as something that's the opposition or the other?
No, I don't view big business as the opposition or the other. And I think one of the things that's fundamentally different about my approach and my strategy is that I actually recognize the collective interdependence of all of these pieces. And I think that for too long, however, one part has been emphasized over the other, and one part has benefited disproportionately over the other. And so what I'm talking about and what I'm suggesting is the idea of beginning to move towards a balance by shifting the prioritization of investments in such a way as to center the little people, right? The small and mid-sized businesses. But I do think there's a critical role for large, businesses and entities to play in this. I think it's important for them to recognize that interdependence and to recognize how they've benefited historically, and to be willing at this point in time, as we seek to not just recover, but actually put in my view, to build a city that's never really existed before, that there's a role that they have to play, and that involves putting a little bit more skin in the game on the front end than they have historically. And so that's what I'm calling for.
And do you think that that's something that you can achieve collaboratively, or do you think that's something that you'll have to drag kicking and screaming out of those interests?
I mean, I'd like to think that I could make the case to make people willing to do that in a collaborative way, right? To bring everybody to the table to work together with a sort of, clear vision around exactly what I just articulated, right? That we need to shift the balance, that the way it's been done historically is not only not working, but it is harming a significant majority of New Yorkers. And so, the only way that we all benefit is if we all benefit. And that means that some of us have to, moving forward, makes more sacrifices than others, in the same way that, low-income Black and brown folks have had to make more sacrifices historically. It's just, we just need to shift that, and we need to shift that in such a way that we can eventually all benefit from it. And I think that's possible. I think there's something compelling about that. And I think that, there's something harmful about the sort of narrative that talks about us or them, as opposed to us and them.
So let me pick up on something that you just talked about, which is investing in communities. And obviously, to make investments in communities, we need resources. And one of the challenges that you would face if you were elected mayor is coming in on January 1st, even with all the federal money that likely is coming our way and is going to deal with this year's budget problems. According to the mayor's own projections, next year, the year after that, we're facing multi-billion-dollar structural deficits that none of this federal money is likely going to solve. And according to some independent budget experts, the problem is actually even deeper than the mayor's own budget projections indicate. And so I guess a question for you is, again, assuming that you get elected and you come to work on your first day and your budget director shows you the ugly picture in front of you, what would you do specifically to try to close that gap?
Right.
Are there specific areas that you would look to trim? Are there specific areas of revenue that you would look to try to increase? How are you thinking about that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, a couple of ways. I understand that the budget next year is not going to look anything like it did 2 years ago. I also understand that, in recent sort of updates, the projections are not quite as dire as they had originally been. That being said, one of the things that I think we've done historically when we face these kinds of situations is we start to sort of signal this need for austerity and that kind of thing. And in fact, that ends up being kind of code in my mind for, to the most vulnerable and the ones that are most struggling to sort of tighten their belts and get ready to shoulder even more of the burden disproportionately than they have historically. Whatever our situation is next year, we are still the wealthiest city in the country. And I think that for me is one of the starting points in thinking about this. The other thing is I would look to start by controlling the things that we can control, and that is the budget that is within our control. And we know that there is a lot of misallocation, misspending, redirection of the city budget that needs to happen. And I'll start with this. The New York City budget. We've been talking about the New York City budget and how problematic it is. And how challenging it is for the last 6 months. And yet suddenly we found the money to send more police officers into the subway stations. It is a question of priorities and of values in terms of how we invest the dollars that we have. The NYPD is larger than the armies of small countries around the world. And I think we need to think hard and fast about what we're doing with those dollars. And so I have actually committed to divesting $3 billion from the NYPD to start. I think that there's a need, just to go down that rabbit hole for a second, there's a need for us to reclaim and redefine what public safety means, really, and to recognize that in most communities, an increase in police presence does not, in fact, result in the community feeling safer or the community being safer. And for too long, we've been divesting from the kinds of services and programs in communities that actually do contribute to safe communities. And so we need to sort of reinvest in those things. We can go back to that, I'm sure. But I also think there's a lot to be said for looking at the rest across the city agencies, across the city budget, looking at lines in different organizations, different agencies that have sat vacant for years, while still holding on to the budget dollars associated with those personnel lines. If a personnel line has been vacant for more than a year, I'm going to go ahead and assume you just don't need that in order to function. So we're going to reclaim that money. I'm also going to take a hard look at external consulting contracts, fancy McKinsey contracts where we provide them with a lot of money to study an issue and produce a report or produce a paper that actually does not go anywhere. Those kinds of things need to be, particularly at a time where we're talking about a budget shortfall, we need to look at those things first before we begin to consider even the possibility of reducing services in schools, reducing dollars to H&H, reducing dollars, anything that are critical direct services to our New Yorkers. Those things are last, right? Or people's jobs. Those things come last. Let's look at where we can trim and how we reallocate and redirect those dollars first. And then the last thing I'll say on that is we also really need to push on the state level and in the Invest in Our New York Act as well. I think that's a critical source.
So you talked about a very substantial cut to the police budget, but my understanding from your platform is that you would plan to reallocate that money elsewhere. So not that that's not a good use of the money, but it doesn't fill the budget gap.
Right.
And then you were talking about empty line items and McKinsey contracts. I mean, do you have a sense as to how much of a $4 billion hole, or maybe it's a $3 billion hole if things go well, you can fill with those kinds of measures? And if it's not a substantial portion, like where else do you look for the money?
Yeah, I think so. We're doing those calculations now because we're about to release our economic platform. But I think that I don't think that's insignificant. And I think a big other piece that we're looking at is both the state, as I said, the Invest in Our New York Act, and we're also looking at what it would look like to roll out a land value tax, which would also increase revenue by a little bit over $1 billion, if I'm not mistaken.
And speaking of taxes, because I think that's another interesting topic where you distinguish yourself from some of the other candidates. My understanding is that you've been much more outspoken about pushing for higher taxes, especially on the wealthy. And I'm just wondering if you can describe what your proposals are and how you would actually go about doing that.
Yeah, so I mean that's largely a state issue. The Invest in Our New York Act is in fact a package of 6 different bills that proposes a more progressive income tax. It's a wealth tax. It's an inheritance tax. It's a wealth transfer tax. So it's a pretty comprehensive package that I suggest everyone take a look at. That I think is actually pretty fair and would sort of begin to catch us up to the sort of the way that wealth has outpaced the taxation in the state in order to help begin to address some of those gaps.
And just on that subject, I mean, again, philosophically, I feel like it's hard to argue that the accumulation of wealth that's occurred over the last 10, 20 years doesn't justify taking more of that wealth and putting it into the hands of the public sector so that we can provide vital services, especially at a time such as this. But one of the things that I've observed, and one of the questions that a patron asked, is with respect to increasing taxes on the wealthy, especially whether it's fair or not, the wealthy are very mobile. And during the pandemic, they've only discovered that it's easier for them to be mobile than they even thought beforehand. And we're in a city where we actually have an extremely progressive tax system where something like 40,000 taxpayers pay almost 40% of our personal income tax. And the question I guess that I have for you is, how concerned are you that if you raise taxes on those individuals at a city level or at a state level, that those individuals, rather than just paying the higher tax rate, will just decide, well, I'm going to spend more of my time in Florida and I can Zoom into all of my meetings?
Yep. The answer to that is not much, not very. I'm not very concerned. There is no evidence of that in the history of the city. I think that actually what we're losing more than anything disproportionately are the low income wage earners who can no longer afford to be here. And there's not as much talk about them and them being sort of pushed out. I also think, New York is an incredible city. There's a reason why people want to be here. There's nowhere, you can't beat the diversity, whether you're talking about racially or linguistically or culturally. It is a hub. It is a mecca, if you will, for people, to run businesses, to live, to go out to eat. And that's not going to go away. We are definitely going through a hard time, but that's not going to go away. And so I think that this is the place where people want to be. And, I think there's, change is hard for everybody, and there's resistance to change under the best of circumstances. But I do think that people will adapt and people will adjust. And I also think that, you mentioned the sort of growth in wealth over the last few years or whatever, but just over the last 12 months, we've seen it, and it's disproportionate, and it's no one gets wealthy without the work of the low and middle class. So no one does it alone, and the fact that folks just that there's such a small representation of the people who do the work to generate that wealth that are actually gaining that wealth and benefiting from that wealth is part of the problem. And I think we just need to address that.
So again, I want to pick up on something that you said to shift topics a little bit. You talked about New York as being a mecca and a magnet and a place that people really want to be. And at least from my perspective, one of the main reasons for that is our arts and culture and entertainment industry, and that sector of the city's economy. And that sector has been particularly hard hit during the downturn. The statistics that I've read are that whereas last year the city lost about 20% of its overall employment, and then gained back about 30% of that 20%, the sector that includes the arts and culture lost about 70% of all employment, and it's only gained back about 5%. But one of the challenges that I've found in having conversations about this devastation with people is that we have a city that's facing a lot of crises. I mean, we know there's a public health crisis. We've talked about the budget crisis. You've talked about inequality, policing issues. I guess, do you think, and if so, how do you make the argument to people that now is the right moment to prioritize thinking about this sector? Or is it the moment now to put it on the back burner and to focus on other things?
I mean, I don't know how we begin to to recover without thinking about this sector, without thinking about the nearly 35,000 New Yorkers who have lost their jobs in the arts and culture. I think it has to be a critical part of any plan to move forward. And for me, I know that when most people hear this topic, they think the traditional sort of the theaters and the museums and that kind of thing. And yes, that's part of it. But as the mother of a young person who has learning differences, who struggled until she found the arts, I also recognize the role that arts play in healing and in education and in mental health. And I think that we have to find a way to incorporate all of those things in our path to move forward. And so, I think we need to bring artists into our schools. We're not talking enough about the impact that this pandemic and these multiple crises have had on our already fragile mental health. And I think that for me, that's been one of the sort of bells that I've been ringing over the last couple of months is we're going to have a different crisis on our hands once we get this COVID-19 pandemic under control. And we're gonna have to be able to pivot really quickly to addressing that if we're gonna actually be able to deal with, execute on all these other economic recovery things. And part of that means putting our, folks from the arts and culture field into putting them to work in supporting mental health, in supporting education, in supporting the healing of our city. And I think that also means, expanding the open culture program so that there are, different, more accessible ways to bring the arts to the people in partnership with the open streets. It also means providing protection to our artists, providing economic security, ensuring that folks have access to the vaccine, and that we are supporting them in getting back to work. But for me, that's a critical part of our recovery for some personal reasons, as well as sort of the larger landscape of the economy.
And I want to pick up on your personal story about your daughter and her experience with finding the arts. We at the 92nd Street Y provide the in-school arts education for 15,000 low-income New Yorkers, primarily low-income New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs. And that's always been a very important part of what we've done. And what we're seeing in the city's education budget is not increases in funding for those kinds of programs. We're seeing real pressure on the budgets. And I'm just wondering, in a Morales administration, how would you prioritize arts education on the very long list of priorities that you're going to have to deal with in a, as we've been talking about, a tight budgetary environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't cut our schools' budgets. We already are struggling so much in terms of, fair student funding, the campaign for fiscal equity. Schools are so much already the first place that it feels like the first place that the cuts are made. And so, I'm fully committed to, I've made a sort of full commitment to fully funding our schools, fully taking on Albany to pursue the funding that we need. And our kids are kids, low income kids, we know who they are. Again, we can't continue